So it's working. Okay, so first thing, if you were absent or didn't come to the meeting yesterday, okay, we went over kind of the expectations and those type of things for the virtual items, and we also went over that worksheet a little bit. But like I said, somebody asked earlier, well, mad because they didn't miss the meeting or whatever. Again, all I can say is we're basically told we got to turn the attendance in. If you're not there, we've got to mark you absent. So, if there's an issue, technology-wise or whatever, then it's probably better to talk to the office. They'll be able to make that decision, not me there. So, going through here, we'll look at the skills and methods part first here. Okay, we'll go over the skills and methods part first. Should take us to the majority of the class, and then we'll go over the historic documents. But again, with this here, a lot of just kind of the note aspects. Some of it's going to be long, and some of it's going to be a lot of gibberish. I promise this is the only day we're really going to spend this much detail on these as we progress through. We're not going to look at every single item. We're going to look at more questions related to it. Okay, so all you're doing is just filling in the blanks as we go through here. Okay, so you've got 4 learning targets that you have for the skills and methods. The first and the 4th are probably the least important. Second and third probably the most important, and I say that just because they tend to target those a lot more. All right, so first one, historical events provide opportunities to examine alternate courses of action. So they're wanting you to look at a historic event and look at that event and say, what would have happened or how would it have changed if this happened? So a lot of those what if type of questions. And the thought is that if you know enough about a historical event, you could possibly look at that what if scenario. Okay, so basically want you to kind of make those decisions, want you to kind of build and think a little bit deeper. And that's kind of what they're wanting there. Just you to not just put yes or no for everything, but kind of expand on your thoughts, kind of expand on your ideas. And again, as we get going here, I'll try to watch and make sure you got everything typed before I move to the screen. If I'm moving too fast, just holler at me. If you're obviously, the classes tomorrow, we'll just pause it, but you guys can't really put a pause on things today. Okay, so you look at some of those scenarios in that next bullet there, and this is kind of what they're wanting you to look at. So you look at some of those scenarios. What if the Democratic Party had not been restored to power in the South? So, that aspect there. What if Abraham Lincoln would have never been assassinated? Okay, he was assassinated. Andrew Johnson took over, and Andrew Johnson started to give some of the power back to the Democrats in the South. So, what if Lincoln's not assassinated? Do we have segregation in the South? Do we have Jim Crow laws in the South? Do we have all that kind of discrimination happening in the South? If Lincoln's still president, maybe, maybe not, who knows? But that's kind of what they're wanting you to look at, want you to kind of think about. That second one there, what if the federal government had not used deficit spending during the Depression? So, if we don't use deficit spending, you'll understand more of this as we get to it, but does that mean America loses more and more money, and instead of becoming, one of the lead economic countries in the world, we become a third world country because of that? Possibility. Who knows? That third one there. What if we don't drop the atomic bombs on Japan? Does that mean we go to war on mainland Japan and possibly lose 100,000 men? Does that mean that we could possibly lose World War II to Japan? Who knows? Right? Same thing, African Americans in the civil rights movement. If Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. aren't killed, assassinated, does the movement take on a different proportion with those guys there the whole time? So that's what they're wanting you to look at, is that what if scenario. What could have happened if this went on or this occurred through there. And so that first one, like I said, you're not going to see this standard a ton, but again, just trying to get you to think a little bit deeper there. Okay. Everybody still typing that? Okay, the second learning target. This is one of the big ones. Analyze and evaluate credibility. So how credible is a witness or a writer, I'm sorry, and then primary and secondary sources. Okay, so when we look at that one there, and we talked a little bit about these on the video yesterday, you got your primary and you got your secondary sources. Okay, so primary sources are going to be firsthand people. Okay, so like we talked yesterday, I think it was a journal entry or whatever. If Natalie's writing a journal and she decides she wants to publish her journal or her diary, that's a primary source because she's the one that wrote the journal. She's the one that's publishing the journal, making it a primary source. Okay, so it could be a memoir or journal, it could be an interview, it could be a video you record of what's happening, anything of that nature. Primary source, somebody was there, somebody filmed it, wrote it, read it, and then published it. Am I still copying that? Yes. Okay, so we've got the primary source, and we move from the primary source, and then we move into what we call that secondary source. All right, so secondary source, a restatement of the primary source. Okay, so this is somebody else taking your information and publishing it. All right, so we go back to that example with Natalie and her diary. She publishes it, it's a primary source. If I get a hold of her diary and I publish it, well, now it's a secondary source because I didn't write the diary, but I want to publish it. Okay, so that's the big difference. Primary, somebody's writing it directly. Secondary, somebody's taking the information and publishing it. Okay, so think about a biography on a person is going to be a secondary source. What type of biography is going to be a primary source? So just a regular biography, secondary. Type of biography is written by the person. Starts with an A. Another word for a car. Yep. Okay, an autobiography. All right, so autobiography would be a primary source because that person is the primary author. Biography, secondary, to somebody else's writing. Okay, you look at your other example is your textbook. Okay, your textbook, even though it has a ton of information, that's a secondary source because your book goes from the Civil War all the way through September 11th. Okay, your book was published in 2010. Right, it's highly doubtful that there was a 140-year-old person sitting in that room typing about what they saw during the Civil War. Okay, so it's secondary because they're taking information from other places. All right, now the next one, and I don't know, my slide just disappeared magically this morning when I was going through, but the next one there says the use of primary and secondary sources includes an analysis of their blank. Does everybody see that? Okay, that one there, it's not going to be on the screen. That answer for that one there should be credibility. So, use of primary and secondary sources in the study of history includes an analysis of their credibility. Are they trustworthy or not? Okay, and there's basically 5 things we should look at to see if something's credible. Are you ever going to look at all 5 things? I would hope not. I hope you don't have a list of everything that you're going to do and write that down. Okay, so again, you're probably just going to summarize. You don't need to know all 5. All right, so the 5 things, and all you gotta do is copy the bold part for them. The first 2, check the qualifications and reputation of the author. So if I wanna see if something's credible, if I should really trust that source, okay, look at the author and say, okay, is this author an expert on the topic? Is this author wrote books about this before? If he has, he's probably pretty credible. Right? If it's somebody though who maybe doesn't have a very good reputation, maybe somebody that maybe is controversial, maybe doesn't put all the facts in there, then maybe they lose a little bit of credibility. Okay, so how trustworthy is this person? What kind of reputation do they have? Is going to go to that credibility aspect. Think about from a school perspective, what's the one website every teacher tells you not to use? Wikipedia. Okay, so Wikipedia, any Joe Schmo could go in there and add stuff to it. So the credibility factor is not there because we can't trust the qualifications of who's putting stuff on there, and we don't know what the reputation is. Okay, so we've got to see those 2 things. The second one, circumstances where they prepared the source. Okay, so again, if I have a professor at a college university and that professor writes a 5-page paper on the differences between the Democratic and Republican Party, there's probably a pretty good chance if he's writing that for his class that he's going to go right down the middle with it. Okay? He's not going to write it because of one thing or another. Now, if I get somebody who's a strong supporter of the Republican or a strong supporter of the Democratic Party, are they going to write that book right down the middle and be fair? Probably not. Okay, they're going to write it in favor of their party. So we got to make sure who the author is, why exactly are they writing this. Good. And the last 3 things we look at, perspective or bias. So again, if somebody is related to a topic, if somebody writes about a topic all the time, there's probably going to be a little bit of bias. A good example of that, has anybody ever heard the name Michael Moore? What was Michael Moore do?
He's biased.
Well, he's biased, but what does he do? Gavin, you raise your hand. What does he do?
I've heard of him.
Yeah. So Michael Moore writes a lot of documentaries or produces documentary films. So Bowling for Columbine was one of his big ones. Fahrenheit 9/11 was a big one. But a lot of his documentaries get a lot of support, but some people argue about his credibility. For example, he wrote about Columbine and the Columbine high school shootings, and this whole documentary was about gun control. Okay, so his documentary is about gun control. All he talks about is basically how we need more gun control, how some of the gun issues are bad. Right? That's bias. He's only talking about one side. So don't necessarily want that from a credible source. How accurate and consistent they are. Right? If somebody's a credible source, they should be writing about the same thing throughout. They shouldn't tell you in chapter 1 that the U.S. lost this battle, and in chapter 5 said the U.S. won the battle. They're probably not going to trust that person if that's the case. And then finally, do they agree with others? Is their information correct? And so, again, are you going to look at all 5 of these when you think about credibility? I hope not. I wouldn't. But just kind of giving you things to think about there. Okay, so target 2 is a credibility, difference between a primary and a secondary source. Okay, target 3, this is the other big one, develop a thesis and use evidence to support or refute a position. And so this one here, I say the first and second paragraph kind of merge on the screen there, but the thought here is if I give you a thesis or a main idea about a paper, you should be able to use stuff from the paper, use stuff that you know to either support it and say, yes, this is why I agree with it, or they say refute it, basically saying that you disagree with it. Okay, so that idea that, if you have a thesis statement or you want to develop a thesis statement, you gotta support it. Okay, at the end of the day, they're telling you, I don't want you to put yes or no for everything. I want you to put yes because of this and because of that happening or going on there. Okay, so identifies your argument, explains how you're going to support your argument. Okay, next part of that looks at the evidence aspect and what's going to be evidence. So they look at evidence there, they talk about the fact about, a detective in order to solve a crime has to get a bunch of evidence. And same thing here, a historian has to get evidence to support their thesis or whatever they're doing. Okay, so you look at different examples there, artifacts, eyewitness accounts, historical accounts, photographs, etc. What's probably became the biggest piece of evidence, if you will, in society today? What's the best evidence we see except for eyewitness accounts? What do people use to showcase eyewitness accounts for things that they're seeing?
Cameras?
Yeah, cameras or cell phones and everything. Okay, think about, 50 years ago, or heck, even 20 years ago, when cell phone cameras and all that stuff wasn't as abundant. You had to wait on stuff to get on the news and stuff to kind of come out and everything else before you heard about it. You might hear about it, some things, a couple weeks later. Okay, you look at during this, time period, you look at the, George Floyd issue. You have somebody recording that, right? All of a sudden, what might have been a few weeks is now out there the next day. Okay, you had a situation this past week, same thing. So, we see more eyewitness accounts through cameras and things like that to support evidence of things that happen. Okay, so we get a little bit of a change today than we probably would have had 20 years ago. Good, and the last one for that one there, historians must cite sources from where they gather evidence. You guys didn't have the pleasure of having Miss Davis last year, but if you had an older sibling, ask them about Miss Davis. Her big thing was citing sources and all that kind of stuff. But again, if you're writing a paper and you're just copying information, not citing the sources, plagiarism. So if I'm a historian, if I'm writing a paper, I got to cite my sources. Hey, this is where I got my information from. This is where I found this picture. This is where I found that fact. Okay, so historians, you got to cite your sources. Okay, then the last learning target, identify examples of multiple causation, long and short-term causal relationship with respect to historical events, analyze the relationship between historical events, taking into consideration cause, effect, sequence, correlation. Everybody understand that one? Probably not. Okay, that one there, it's long, it's confusing. at the end of the day, they basically just want you to understand cause and effect. Okay, so, how can a history event cause some things to happen? How can it affect some things to happen, whether it's short-term or long-term? So earlier on the screen, we had the example of the U.S. dropping the atomic bombs. All right, so we think about that when they're short-term and long-term causes and effects. All right, so why did the U.S. decide to drop the atomic bombs on Japan? Now, they were in World War II, but what made the U.S. declare war on Japan? What did Japan do to us? Pearl Harbor. Okay, so because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we declare war on Japan, which eventually leads to dropping the atomic bomb. So you see the cause and effect there. Okay, when they talk about short-term effects, we dropped the atomic bombs on Pearl Harbor or on Hiroshima. What ends up happening when that bomb hits? What's starting to happen to people right away? They're dying. Okay, so short-term effect, people are dying, and then within a few days, what does Japan do in World War II? They don't keep fighting. They do what? No. What are they going to do? If they want out of the war, they say, we're done. They what? They surrender. Okay, so short-term effect, people died, Japan surrendered. Long-term effect, there was another country out there in Eastern Europe that said, hey, check that out. The U.S. just made an atomic bomb. Look at all the damage it did. We're going to make one that's bigger and better so we can use it on somebody. What country in Eastern Europe, communist country, might have been thinking that? Yep.
North Korea.
Who?
North Korea.
No, that'd be today. More, think back 1940s. Right today, that North Korea would be the one. Think back then. No. And Stalin, the Bolsheviks.
Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union. Okay, so the Soviet Union looked at it and said, hey, sweet, the U.S. just made this atomic bomb. We're going to make one bigger and better. Right? When they start making atomic bombs, it leads to kind of war between the U.S. What do you call that little conflict between the U.S. and Soviets? Lasted about 45 years. The Cold War. Okay, so an effect of us dropping the atomic bomb long term was the Cold War. Okay, so that's kind of what they're wanting you to do. And there's the next part there. That's kind of what they're wanting you to do in that regard. Okay. The other part of this is from a history perspective. When I look at things in history, they're usually in one of three categories. They're either social, which would be your family, your education, your religion, that kind of stuff. So it either falls in the social category, the political category, which would be cause and effect relationships with government, with laws, with the military. All right? And if it's not social or political, the third category can fall into is economic. So dealing with money and taxes and that kind of stuff. So every time we look at something, we should be able to say, okay, that falls into either the social, economic, or political category. Are you going to do that every single time? No. Okay, but something that you should be aware of there. Okay, and then the last one for this learning target involves the examination of the correlation of the events. Did one event lead to another? Do they relate to each other and so forth? So we were talking about Pearl Harbor leading to us declaring war on Japan, which led to the atomic bombs. Now you think about on the other side, France and Britain got involved in World War II, not because Japan bombed them, but because of Germany and Adolf Hitler. Okay, so they got involved in World War II for a completely different reason. But at the end of the day, did the U.S. and Britain help each other in the war? Absolutely. Okay, so even though they had different reasons for getting involved, they still worked together. And that's what they're looking at there. Okay, so once you have that one copied, you can close that document. And then on Classroom, there's a second document I put on there today called Historical Docs Outline. Go ahead and open that one up and we'll look at it next.